You're listening to Under the Shell Podcast, the best in America.
Welcome to Under the Shell, presented by Testudo Times. I'm Brendan Weissel.
I'm Jane.
And Michael Howes, and this week we got a special basketball-related guest. Our next guest was inducted into the University of Maryland Athletics Hall of Fame on October 18th. He was a 2002 Wooden Award All-American and a three-time All-ACC honoree, one of just 15 Terps to garner that honor 3 times. He helped Maryland to back-to-back Final Four appearances, including the 2002 National Championship. We are so honored to have on Lonnie Baxter this week. Lonnie, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Awesome. So let's start with the recent induction. Like, what did that mean to you to get into the Athletics Hall of Fame here at Maryland?
It was just a dream come true. Me being a kid that grew up in Maryland, always wanted to play for the Terps, and just the whole legacy of playing under Gary Williams and, the national championship, everything. It was just icing on the cake.
And I know a lot of your former teammates were at that ceremony. Just what did it mean to you to see all the guys there?
It was great. Some of them we haven't seen in a long time. It was just a great feeling. Juan was there, Byron Mouton, Steve Francis, Gary Williams, Coach Passos, Walt Williams, Johnny Rose. Some guys who played before me. So it was really nice event. With a lot of legends in the house.
Have you stayed connected with a lot of those guys, or was it your first time seeing them in a little bit?
I stay connected with most. I speak to Johnny all the time. Walt Williams, every time I come back to games, he does the radio there. And, me and Steve Francis talk all the time. We have a group chat where, whenever it's everybody's birthday, all the Terrapins, Coach Williams, even our trainers, some of our managers from the team, we all keep in touch. So we're pretty close-knit.
When you came to Maryland, there's a story about how kind of you were told that you weren't going to play much and that type of thing. When do you think you really made the impression on the coaches that, like, hey, I can be a valuable part of what we want to do here?
Probably towards the end of my freshman year. Abina Akizi, our starting center, had gotten hurt. He had tore his ACL, so I had to step in and fill in his shoes. And, once I stepped in from there, it was just a different situation. Like I said, when I came into Maryland, the expectations weren't that high for me. They were saying, this person's in front of him, he's not going to play. But like I say, after the end of that freshman year, everything changed after Abina Akizi got hurt and I stepped in for him.
Speaking of your freshman year, your roommate, Juan Dixon, obviously, I think you called him your big brother from the jump. Give us your best Juan story. We're talking to him later on, and know that he's got a pretty funny personality. So what's a good off-the-court story the two of you guys have?
There's so many. I probably couldn't say it on camera, but Steve Francis was my roommate from freshman year.
My bad. Yeah, Steve Francis.
That's cool.
And for both of those guys, like, you played with obviously some great guys. Juan, Steve Blake too. It was there. Who really stood out to you as kind of like somebody that you looked up to for maybe their work ethic or who they were on the court?
Steve Blake, he was the guy that ran our offense. He was the guy that kept us in check. He was a person who could score, but he was pass first. Always fed the ball to me inside. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have the career I had. So Steve Blake is definitely the most important glue guy for the Maryland Terrapins.
One of the funniest things about Steve Blake that I've seen is there's footage of a fight that he got into in 2002. There's some hands were being thrown. Can you kind of describe that moment for us? What happened?
Steve is just a competitor. Things got a little chippy, during pickup one summer. And I think it was him and John Gilchrist got into a little scuffle. But, it's just brotherly love. A little love taps never hurt anybody. So that's just who Steve is.
What was Gary's reaction there? Was he kind of like the competitiveness, or was he like, get on the line, we're all running?
Oh, he definitely loved it. I don't think Gary was there that day. I think Jimmy Passos was there, a couple former players. It was summertime pickup, but like I say, a little love taps never hurt anybody. It's just those guys being competitive. They got chippy and just they they laughed it off, went to eat together later on, and that's that.
Were your practices usually high intense like that at Maryland? Like, what was the intensity level?
Well, playing for Gary Williams, if it wasn't intense, you weren't going to play for him. You might as well not even showed up if you thought you were going to have a easy practice. But yeah, all the practices were intense. Every day was like game day. That's how we practiced, and this is how we competed, and that made us who we were.
I wanted to ask about the two Final Four years. So after you guys fall to Duke in 2001, I believe, you guys, I believe you wanted to face Duke again in the Final Four. It would have been in the national championship that year. Can you kind of describe the rivalry that you guys had with the Blue Devils at that time? And obviously, you didn't end up facing them in the national championship, but what was that relationship like with the Blue Devils?
They were in our conference back then when we played in the ACC, so we saw them, many times throughout the year in tournaments, and we felt like we should have won in 2001 against them, but things happened and we lost. And then the next year we came back. We didn't get a chance at them, at the Final Four because they lost to Indiana, and that's who we played in the national championship. We just, like I said, we won that year. We were determined to get back to that stage. We weren't going to let anything, keep us from getting back to that stage where we felt like we should have won. So that's why we were so hungry and so determined to win a national championship in 2002.
What did you guys learn from that first Final Four experience that you kind of carried into 2002?
Just to never give up. I mean, we thought we had that game won up 22 at half, and then the second half, things took a turn for the worse. So we became more resilient. We became more just, foot on their throats when we come out. Don't let up. Just keep going, keep grinding, and it's never over until the buzzer sounds.
Sorry to bring back a bad memory for you, but I've seen the 2001 game, and you got called for a foul late on. I think you kind of named the phantom foul. What happened on that play? Kind of take everybody who, for guys like us, we weren't even alive. So give us the kind of break.
To be honest with you, I don't even know what happened. I just fell to my knees in disbelief. Like, are you serious? But I mean, whatever calls were made, whatever things happen, you just got to live with it, make the best out of it, and learn from your mistakes.
You guys are one of the only national championship winning teams without a McDonald's All American. Is that something you guys knew, afterwards or into that game? And how much was that kind of like a, not to use a cliche, but the chip on your shoulder type thing?
Of course, we were a bunch of young, hungry guys that were just out to prove themselves. Like you said, no McDonald's All Americans, just wanting to win. And show guys that we were able to compete for a national championship with anybody. We weren't afraid to play anybody. Whoever we faced, we were there to show guys that we were serious.
So now you're working as a product specialist at Coons Ford Silver Spring. I was kind of wondering, how did you get into the car dealership post your playing career? Was that something you had your eyes on before, or is that just something you kind of got into?
Nah, it's something I just kind of fell into. You know, um, I met a person, who told me, he was like, I'm going to hire you because I know you're going to have great work ethic. His name was Kyle Robson. He was like, I know you're going to have great work ethic because you played for Gary Williams. And since that day, I've just been selling cars and haven't thought about anything else.
Give us your best pitch. How do you sell a car to somebody? How do you do it?
I mean, I've been doing it for what, 5 years now. So, it's all about how you greet the customer. Firm handshake, just show them the vehicle, and then after that, these days vehicles pretty much sell themselves. So, um, it's not much to it these days. It's a lot of hours, a lot of time invested, but it's worth it.
I wanted to ask, to give you the chance to kind of explain, because I don't know many Maryland fans have heard from you. In 2006, I think we read that you were arrested for there was a gun outside the White House. What happened, and how much did you learn from that situation?
Yeah, back in 2006, coming from iBar in DC, just partying too much, a little bit to drink, just being irresponsible, being young, it led to, a gun being fired, and I was arrested, did 60 days in jail. I learned from that mistake, just something that, I had to put behind me, just part of my growing experience. But it's just an unfortunate incident. But thank God no one was hurt, and it
Yeah.
was just something that happened, years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, to kind of you learn from that and move on. And now, being in the car dealership, how much do you still pay attention to basketball? Like, do you still watch Maryland? Do you watch other teams? I know you obviously played in the NBA and played for some a variety of different teams. So, how much do you still pay attention to hoop?
Yeah, I was just at the Maryland game against St. Mary's on Friday, so yeah, I definitely pay attention to the Terrapins. What's his name? Rodney Rice had an amazing game. I think he had like 28 points off the bench, 26 in the first half. So I'm always paying attention to the Terrapins and what they're doing. So
What do you think about this year's team? Who kind of has stand out to you so far? I mean, obviously you saw Rodney Rice go off, but anybody else kind of flashed to you so far?
I think Derek Queen is going to be big for those guys. He's been amazing. His first game, where did he have 25 and 20 rebounds or something? Amazing. I mean, that's something you can't teach. So I think he's going to be a big factor this year, and they got a lot looking forward to this season.
As a big man, kind of explain to non-basketball players how difficult it is to get a 20 and 20 game. I mean, he was the first Maryland freshman to ever do it, first Maryland player, in 30 odd some years, I think. How difficult is that type of performance, and how much does that kind of, no matter the opponent, how much do you take away from that as a former player?
I mean, 20 rebounds is huge, no matter where you play. And for him to do that his first outing as a Terrapin is very impressive. I mean, that takes a lot of skill, a lot of effort. So I think he's going to be a very special player for the Terps, and I'm very excited to see what he brings this year.
I want to kind of get into your career after Maryland on the basketball side. You obviously get drafted in the NBA draft that year after. What's that kind of like? You're kind of bouncing around teams in the NBA, fighting for those roster spots.
It's definitely making the NBA is a dream come true. Competing for minutes. Going from team to team, as a person who's, a journeyman, it's just a big learning experience. You learn a lot about life, about yourself. But still, just being in the NBA period is a dream come true.
This is a question asked to a lot of NBA players, but what was your welcome to the NBA moment when you got to the league? Is there a specific time you remember being like, whoa, this is a different level of competition?
I remember one exhibition game we were playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, and Kevin Garnett was the most intense player I've ever seen. I mean, he was cursing and swearing, blocking shots. He was in a full sweat before the game. And I remember, I'm like, whoa, like, this is really serious. This is a different level than college. And I mean, he's 6'11", 7-foot wingspan, and he's just one of my favorite players I always looked up to.
What's it like playing overseas? I mean, you're from Maryland, obviously. Um, we've talked to Anthony Cowan, who played abroad, and he kind of explained the process of it. What was it like back then, especially in the early 2000s, playing internationally?
My first international experience, I played in Greece for Panathinaikos. So my first time away from leaving the states, it was a great experience. Greece is one of my favorite countries to play in. Um, the team opened me with welcome arms, and it was just a wonderful experience. Easy place to play, easy place to live, great cultural city. Just a great experience for my first time overseas.
Didn't James Gist play there? Do you
Yes,
do you
he
happen to
did.
know James Gist? That's our guy. We had him on like one of our first episodes. Awesome dude.
Yeah, I saw him at the game on Friday. So
Man, that's great. Um, did is it when you play abroad, obviously, how much do you have to learn the culture too alongside the basketball, or are you kind of just there for business? Like what's that kind of relationship like?
you definitely have to learn the culture to know what's going on around you, to bond with your teammates, your coaches, and people in the city. So it's definitely a learning curve that you have to get used to. But like I say, when I played my first season in Greece, it was no problem at all adjusting. It was very easy. Just one of my favorite places I've always been.
After Maryland in the professional world, you played on, I think, around 10 teams from 2002 to 2013. Was there a favorite year of your career at some point in there, either in the NBA or in Europe?
I would definitely say all the years I spent 3 years in Greece. Just like I said, it was just an easy transition for me, easy city to live in. Playing for the best team, Panathinaikos. Also played for a team named Panionios and Glafada. And just the whole experience is just very welcoming. Just the best you can have just coming into a city like that.
Do you have a favorite story from when you were at Maryland, playing under Gary Williams? What's your favorite story under Coach Williams?
Favorite story. Coach is very intense. And then, whenever, we didn't start off the game the right way, he was always yelling at the bench, asking teammates, like, what did I eat for lunch or dinner? Or, like, why is he not doing, what he's supposed to do? But, I mean, there's so many stories of just Gary just being, who he is. And he just instilled a lot of, grit and confidence in us. And he's just the greatest coach ever.
I read a story that you and Steve one practice were, I think, like chewing on your jersey or something, and he said like, stop eating your shirts, you're not at breakfast,
Oh
which
yeah, our,
captures the
our, our
persona.
first Maryland practice at Ritchie Coliseum. We were chewing on our jerseys. It's a bad habit we had, and he just looked at us like, "You two guys, what is wrong with you? Like, why are you eating your shirt?" And we just bust out laughing, and like he just had that intensity from he coached us hard from day one.
Definitely learned your lesson quick there. I know that some of the environments in Europe and in Greece get pretty crazy. How would you say that Cole Fieldhouse, kind of in its peak, early 2000s, compares to some of those environments in Europe?
Cofer House was the greatest. It was a loud arena. The way it was set up, the seats at the bottom, and it's like a big bowl you come into. The noise just carried over. It was a pretty hostile environment coming in the Coalfield House. One of the greatest stadiums. I actually won a city title there when I played for Anacostia High School, so I'm very familiar with Coalfield House, and it is kind of similar to one of those European arenas.
Obviously, you mentioned you've kind of been in the car industry for the past 5 or so years, but have you been playing any basketball? Like after you finished, would you still kind of play recreationally, or did your career kind of end after 2013?
I spend a lot of time here, so I'm at the dealership most of the time, most of the day. I just do some things that kind of stay in shape, but I haven't really played in a while. So hopefully I get out there soon when I find some time. But I'm mostly, just selling cars here all the time.
Lonnie, I bet you could still give a good, 13-8 if you were playing there.
I don't know. I mean, I'll be 46 in January, so I need a lot of icy hot or Bengay, but
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on. Again, thank you for your time and good luck at the car dealership. And hopefully, we maybe see you around at a Maryland game.
yes, sir. Thank you for having me.
All right, guys, it is an absolutely loaded slate. Probably the busiest Maryland sports weekend and week we're going to have all year. The biggest thing, we got to start football in Oregon. Sam, you made the trip all the way out there. Kudos to you. What did you say?
Shout out Eugene, Oregon, man. One of the prettiest stadiums I've ever been. That's the first thing. But wasn't as pretty on the field for Maryland. Another tough loss, 39-18 against the Ducks. To kind of rehash everything we've talked about this season, this felt like very similar to other games Maryland's played against top teams in the past. Ohio State last year comes to mind, Michigan the year before, Penn State in 2021. These are games that Maryland hangs around for a bit before losing, and I think the biggest element when you look at this one is the turnovers, guys. Billy Edwards, I think, isn't to blame for this season. I think he's actually been one of the better players on this team, but a couple of mistakes, poor offensive line play. He clearly looks skittish back there, and that turned the game on its head. I mean, the fumble touchdown in the first half, that set the game off on a tumble that Maryland just never recovered from. I think that this football team, we've talked about it all season, is flawed. Oregon played not great. I think they played a C- level performance. Maybe Maryland forced them into it. Maybe they didn't. Oregon had a ton of penalties and drops. And then Maryland's not good enough to not play perfect football and beat the number one team in the country. They had to play in a perfect game, and Maryland had to play bad, or Oregon had to play bad. One of those two things happened. The other didn't, and they lost. And I think that, and ultimately, that's what it boils down to. We can talk about individual plays like the Terrence Ferguson stepping out of bounds, the fumble, all these things that, obviously hurt Maryland, but they were not winning that game unless they played pretty much pristine level of play. And that's not what happened. And eventually these losses where you hang around for, a half, a quarter, that type of thing, and ultimately end up losing by 2 scores. When is that like? That's not necessarily something fans, I think, are accepting at this point. It's one thing to say, oh, we competed against the number one team in the country. Well, you still lost by 3 touchdowns. So I just think that they're not saying it's a moral victory, so credit to them. I just don't think anybody should really be saying that at this point.
I know you mentioned Billy Edwards being skittish. I know we've talked about the O-line in the past, and I'm not saying the O-line is the number one problem on this team. But again, when you build an O-line through the transfer portal, one, there's going to be no cohesiveness in that unit for the season, the first season at least. And number two, there's a reason that they're in the transfer portal in the first place. So you're just not going to get a good product out of that. I think we've seen that with Edwards in some of these games, especially, 2 picks against Oregon, the number one team in the country. And then Roman Hemby, high expectations for him this season. Obviously, he hasn't performed to the point that we thought he would. Don't know if that's offensive line related because he did have a little bit of a down year last year too, following that sophomore year. But I think a lot of these issues can tie back to the offensive line and the way that Loxley constructed this roster.
When you talk about offensive line, you make a great point. They're in the transfer portal for a reason. But another thing, if you look across the country, the O-lines that have performed the best are usually the O-lines that have been the same every single week of the season. Maryland obviously hasn't had that. Injuries happen. Maryland got rid of their O-line coach. So it's like not having a consistent offensive line is also a big factor in that. You could put 5 guys who probably aren't the 5 best players at that position in the country, maybe not in the top 10, but the chemistry gets built, and Maryland obviously hasn't had that this season. That's the point on the O-line. Sam talked about 2 plays that I want to bring up, and I want to bring up a third play. All that to say, Oregon did not look good in the first quarter. In fact, Oregon looked bad. I'm not sure how many drop passes they had, but they had a lot. They had kickoffs or punts that didn't look great. They muffed a punt that could have changed the entire first half. Overall, Oregon did not play a very good first 20 minutes of that football game. What really changed that game and swung momentum in Oregon's favor was the fumble 6. Billy Edwards dropped back, got hit. Very clearly a fumble. I'm not trying to argue that it's not a fumble. The one thing that I did not understand is that there was a ref in the middle of the field waving his arms that the pass is incomplete. At that point, the play should be dead. Maryland players, I assume, stop playing. If you're a player and you see a ref blowing the play dead, you're pretty much told not to keep playing. Oregon ran the ball back all the way for a touchdown. It was reviewed. The touchdown stood. I just don't understand how that play stands and how Loxley on the sidelines isn't incredibly upset at the fact that his team just got robbed of 7 points. At the end of the play, that should have been Oregon's ball. I'm not arguing that it wasn't a fumble, but it was just kind of ridiculous that the play wasn't blown dead. Sam, you were in the stadium. Did you see Loxley on the sideline? What kind of happened there on that play? You obviously had a much better look. I could only look at what was happening on the TV. So what did you see on that play from your perspective, and how do you rate it?
Yeah, I think that play, obviously I saw the ref and I immediately pointed out, and then you posted on Twitter. I do think that, out of the plays to be upset about, the one where Terrence Ferguson stepped out of bounds to me was so obvious. Clearly stepped out, ball went into his hands. That should be a penalty. That play was reviewable, and they didn't call it. Loxley, after the game, he's not a blame the refs guy, but he even was like, yeah, they must have thought it wasn't conclusive. To me, it was very obvious. Why do you have replay if that's not the call? In the first half, Maryland played very well, especially defensively. If you look at the stats, they held the Ducks to one of their season low in rushing yards, only 36 rushing yards, and then only allowed 128 passing plays. They forced a 6 out of 19 third down 6 out of 17 third down conversion rate. So very good. They trailed by 11, and if you take those 2 touchdowns away and turn them into maybe field goals, you're looking at a completely different game. 13 to 13-10 at half. And that's obviously very different. So there's some positives to take away. I think the defense played its best game of the season, limiting Oregon, obviously without Tez Johnson, one of the nation's best receivers, but still encouraging signs from Brian Williams' defense. It's just they are unable to play, and Loxley keeps saying it, and I would blame him if it wasn't true, but they cannot play a complementary game where the offense plays well and the defense plays well and the special teams, doesn't mess something up. They're incapable of doing that right now. And that's the sign to me of a bad football team. And that's what Maryland is at this point. They're a mediocre to below average football team. I wouldn't even say mediocre. They're below average.
I think the excuse of not playing complementary football is just really lame, honestly. Like, yeah, you didn't play, like you said it, Sam, they didn't play a good football game. I mean, it doesn't take the best analyst in the world to tell you that. And so I understand why that's something like Loxley is saying, because it's just not happening. But I don't know. I think it would be better for him to get up there and give way more specifics on what happened instead of just saying the offense didn't play well and when the defense played well. And obviously anybody could tell you that.
Yeah, if you don't play complementary football consistently, there's something is wrong. Like, it's not like, oh, well, eventually we're going to put it together. Like, there's clearly something up with this team where their units aren't talented enough for complementary football. That's eventually what it is. As we look forward, they have Rutgers this upcoming week, 6:00. Maryland always seems to beat Rutgers. Rutgers beat Minnesota the last week. Arthur Kaliak-Manis threw for a bunch of yards. So passing attack, they lost one of the Kyle Manungai, who's one of the country's top running backs. He's out, but they have clearly recovered, and Greg Schiano runs a pretty good program. So it should be a pretty solid game, close game, I think. But even if they win that, I find it hard to believe Maryland's going to win 2 out of these next 3, Iowa and Penn State. Guys, before we move off football, what % chance would you put it at Maryland becoming bowl eligible? So winning 2 out of these final 3, or, the impossible happens and they win all 3.
I would say a 50-50 chance. I mean, look, you've got 2 games at home against unranked opponents. Rutgers, obviously, we talked about it. Maryland's got the recent history against Rutgers. And then Iowa's only 6-4. All you got to do is win 2 straight home games against unranked teams, and you can head into Happy Valley not stressing that you got to win against a top 5 program to make a bowl game. I think it's manageable, but we've also seen this Maryland team drop a game to Northwestern, drop a game to Michigan State. So that's why I'm saying 50-50. Like, literally either side could happen.
Brendan?
I'll point to one very basic stat, and it's one I've looked at all season. Rutgers right now, 5-4. Iowa, you mentioned it, 6-4. For those at home who may not know much about records, they currently have a winning record. I could include Penn State too. Sure, they're 8-1, top 5 team in the country. That's not really a game worth talking about in terms of Maryland making a bowl game. It rests on Rutgers and Iowa. The point of making all season is under Mike Loxley, Maryland football has very rarely beat Power 5 teams, Power 4 teams, whatever you want to call it, with winning records. And so I just don't see it happening. You'd have to win 2 of those in a row and change the trend. Maybe Rutgers would end up the year with a losing record if they lost to Maryland. But at the end of the day, it seems unlikely, having to play 3 teams that currently have winning records this late in the season, that it would happen for Maryland. I mean, if you're a Maryland fan, here's what you have to be thinking. You have to be thinking, I'd rather punt and lose the Rutgers game and lose the Iowa game and beat Penn State and ruin their season. So if you're a Maryland fan, that's honestly probably what you're rooting for.
Another stat to point out, and I think Brendan's right, Maryland has never won 2 consecutive games in the final 3 games of the season under Mike Loxley. So to end the year on this type of high note would be an aberration so far.
So you're saying they're going to beat Rutgers, lose to Iowa, and beat Penn State, or?
I'm not saying that. I would put this at, I put it like a 15% chance they make a bowl game. 50-50 is wild. So,
yeah, I forgot to give my percent chance. I'll put it at 12.
Yeah, good number, Brendan.
Thanks.
What's not, I think what we can say will be a little higher is probably the biggest game of the week upcoming. Maryland basketball, men's basketball. We can spend very little time on the past game here against Florida A&M. Just some quick highlights. Julian Reese finally broke out, led the team in scoring. Selton Miguel also had a really, really nice game. So that was good to see. And Derek Queen got benched to start the second half. Really quick off that game, what do we think about Queen's benching? Do we think it's justified? He did not play great in the first half. You should check out my story on Inside Maryland Sports where I followed the freshman. But Mike, what do we think about benching Queen and kind of maybe sending a message here early on in the season by Coach Kevin Willard?
That was definitely Kevin Willard sending a message to his young star. You're not all that. You've got to humble yourself a little bit. But I mean, Queen played in the second half. Everybody knows that's not going to be a continuing trend throughout the season. And it's also been good since last week we saw against Manhattan, Derek Queen basically led the team, rebounds, points. It's been really promising to see the past two games, guys, like Jacoby Gillespie and Rodney Rice step up into those roles, especially Rodney Rice, who, I mean, do we want to talk about that first half performance he had the other night?
I forgot to mention Rice. Yeah,
Yeah, like
incredible performance. I mean,
Off the bench, I mean, unbelievable.
if I think him and Miguel determine this team's ceilings, or the wings at least, add Deshaun Harris-Smith in there. We know Queen and Reese are kind of proven commodities. I think at this point we know Jacoby Gillespie is going to be a very solid Big Ten point guard. The wings, to me, determine how good this team will be. If Rodney Rice and Sel Miguel can be proven Big Ten scorers, potentially tertiary to options off the bench as scorers, I think this team's ceiling rises dramatically. And I think that if Rice or Miguel can continue to play like how they have been early on this season, you're looking at a Big Ten contender, I think, in Maryland.
I think the biggest thing to look forward to, and you mentioned it, is the Marquette game. I've had my eyes on Marquette to start the season because they did something that I love and I think Maryland should do, and I think more college programs across the country should do. They played in an old gym and they played only in front of students. Super cool thing. Something Maryland should definitely consider when they're playing teams like Manhattan, Mount St. Mary's, Florida A&M, and the Xfinity Center looks hilarious because there's nobody there. With all that being said, Marquette has had a decent start to the season. They're undefeated and they're a top 15 team in the country, I believe, at the moment. What's the exact ranking? Do you know?
They were 15th before the rankings came out last. I think they still are. Let me double check for you. But I know that they have one of the nation's top scorers in Cam Jones, shooting guard, who has only played in a game, but it was one of the best players in the country last year. And is averaging around 30 points a game. So Cam Jones will obviously be a problem. Guys, when we look at this upcoming game, let's preview it. Let's break it down. Marquette, the 15th team in the country. I was right. So when you look at this, Shaka Smart, we know presses. We know he plays an aggressive style of defense. They lose a couple of guys. Tyler Kolek, one of the nation's best point guards. Osa Igimanosa, a center who was really good, went to the NBA as well. But Cam Jones, again, top scorer. How do we think Maryland tries to slow him down? Is that a Selton Miguel? Is that a Deshaun Harris-Smith assignment? Are they trying to send multiple bodies? What are we thinking for Maryland's defensive game plan for Friday?
My guess is this game is going to be a ridiculously a marathon, if you will. Both teams are probably going to be pressing for the majority of the game. If you look at the two head coaches, obviously, you talked about it, Sam. And that's my guess is how they're going to try to slow it down. Maryland's press at points in the season has looked incredible and at points has looked pretty bad. And that's tough to say when you've played three teams who are, in the bottom 100, bottom 50 in KenPom. The Maryland press to start the Florida A&M game looked incredible. It looked like best press in the country, but, that only really lasted for the first 8 minutes. So we'll see if Kevin Willard kind of backs off once they start getting beat. And I really do think this is going to be a pretty long game. I would expect there to be a lot of fouls, a very physical marathon of a game. That's my prediction.
I'm not going to give a prediction, but I'm going to say what I'm most looking forward to, and that's seeing what Deshaun Harris-Smith does. Almost everybody's had their moment now this season. Julian Reese had his moment last game. Obviously, Gillespie's had his moment. Rice had his moment. Derek Queen had his moment in his debut. But we haven't really seen much from Deshaun Harris-Smith, who he's playing 21 minutes per game and only averaging 5 points a game. And this was someone who we were, kind of expecting to jump going into his sophomore year, and he hasn't really been much except for a defensive presence. So I'm kind of looking forward to see what his role is and if it kind of stays that way. Also, Selton Miguel, obviously he's been hurt. Coach Willard said he was dealing with an ankle injury, only averaging 8 points right now. So definitely interested to see what those two roles are.
And yeah, Deshaun Harris-Smith is going to play a huge role because Marquette's guards are really good. They're a very guard-heavy team. Stevie Mitchell, I didn't mention, led them in scoring. Just to give a breakdown, they haven't really played anybody good. They recently played Central Michigan, and it was 62-70 win for the Golden Eagles, but they've also played George Mason and Stony Brook. I think and just to boil this game down, 3 factors. One, the press. Which team is able to force more turnovers? Brendan talked about it. Maryland forces around 12 a game. If they can get that up to maybe 13, 14, 15, I think you give them yourselves a much better chance. 2, how does Jacoby Gillespie play against high-level guards, right? We've seen him play now against poor competition. We know that he's good against that. How does he play against, a top 25 team and their guards? And then 3, I think, is what Maryland's shooting performance is, right? We know that they got some guys who are capable. Rodney Rice, Salt Miguel, Gillespie. These guys can all shoot it. If they're able to kind of strike it at a 36, 37% rate, I think you're probably looking at a Terps win. I would put this game, I think it's going to be very close. If I had to give an official prediction, I would say 70 to 65 Maryland win. And I think it's going to be a really fun game. And a game that I think down the stretch could be an important win for Maryland. So it's not a must win, but I think it's something that you really want to have if you're Kevin Willard to avoid kind of the slow start you had last year.
This game is going to tell us so much about the Maryland team. I frankly have no idea how good they are. I know they're not as bad as they were last year. At least I don't think they are. But I'm not quite sure if they are, the team that we think if you look at the roster, we think this team could be really, really good. But it's so hard to tell if you just have watched the first 3 games. The opponents aren't very good. The stats are also hard to look at because the last 8-9 minutes of the game, they're not really playing to their true form. When you have, walk-ons in the game, it's like, you never really know. There's a lot of variables there. So this game is going to tell us a ton about Maryland. And it's one, if you're a Maryland basketball fan, I think you kind of have to be glued in on, just because this is going to probably dictate how the rest of the season goes. It happened last year in the first 2 weeks. You saw that the team really wasn't going to be that good. And maybe it doesn't necessarily dictate it, but it'll give you an idea of what the season is going to be like. If it's going to be a good season, if it's going to be a painful season, it's going to be the best season of your life. You really have no idea. And that's why, it's cool to have an important game at home this early in the season.
Season starts now. I think that's what it boils down to.
Absolutely.
So it'll be a big game. And we had one of those kind of home ranked matchups with the other part of the basketball side, the women's team, and they prevail, beating number 11 Duke 85-80. Kind of an interesting game. If you look at the recap, Maryland could not inbound the basketball. Had a bunch of turnovers off that, but they also forced a bunch of turnovers. Duke struggled, but the Terps prevailed. Brendan, what did you kind of take away? I think our first viewing against a high quality opponent, you have to feel very encouraged by Brenda Freese's team, who was able to score 85 points against a very good Blue Devils defense.
We answered one of our questions we were trying to answer at the beginning of the year is how deep is this team? And it's pretty clear it's 8 people deep. The biggest takeaway was Bree McDaniel. She hadn't had the greatest start, and obviously it wasn't starting. So it was a question of, really what's her role going to be on this team? And she really caught fire in that game against Duke, went for 15 points, but 15 very important points. My biggest takeaway is that I think this team is really good, and I think they can probably compete with the top teams in the country. They obviously got ranked at number 11, but just because of their depth and their ability to do what they didn't have last year, which is rest their top players, this team is looking very good. Also, the finishing ability is something they didn't have last year. Kayleen Schmeichel has looked incredible going to the basket and scoring, and just overall, Sayla Poffenbarger, who we obviously had on the podcast. There was one specific play that stood out to me. Shot clock winding down, second half, takes her defender one-on-one, goes to the hoop and makes a beautiful layup. Maryland just didn't have someone who was a forward, who could hit threes and do that last year. It's a huge addition to the team. And I thought they looked really good.
I think the 2 transfers that have made the biggest impact is Schmeichel, obviously 23 points. I think, I had a colleague and somebody I know say this, that he thinks they're going to be the leading scorer. And I wouldn't be surprised. I think Schmeichel is, Cheyenne Sellers is this team's best player. I think Schmeichel might be the best scorer. 3 levels, obviously has some serious bursts. She was a great scorer at Rutgers, and she's carried it over here clearly. They're trusting her to kind of be that, secondary to first option, and she's played amazing. And then Christina Dulce, it really impressed me defensively. She's being asked to do a lot, but to score 12 points and grab 14 rebounds, I mean, that is a very, very solid stat line that Maryland didn't have last season. So, Mike, I think if you look at this team now, I mean, they should be undefeated, arguably until they play USC. They have a couple of conference games here coming up, but relatively easy opponents in conference. And if you look at the squad, they're poised to be at the top of the Big Ten. I love this team's depth, like Brendan said. I think they have really good high-level scorers. I think they're very versatile. The thing is, they have to cut down on the turnovers. That's number one. And I think they have to continue to defend at a high level, especially against post players. That's my number one concern. Duke didn't have that. You're going to see that in the Big Ten. Hannah Stuelke, Lauren Betts, these players, they're going to have big bodies. I don't know if Maryland has that, but right now, I love how the Terps look.
I'm interested to see how much longer Allie Quebec stays in that starting lineup. I think that could be a spot that Poffenbarger fills later on in the season. I was looking forward to see what Quebec does this season heading into the year, but she hasn't really done much so far, playing 23 minutes a game, only averaging 5 points. I thought she was going to be spaced out a little bit more on offense, take a little bit more threes like she did when she was playing at Towson, but she's only taken about 2 threes a game. She was taking about 3 at Towson, shooting 33%. This year, she's at 16%. So, I mean, she's been playing quietly offensively. Defensively, she's a liability on the perimeter. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, like Brendan said, very deep. And I think this team could be among the best in the Big Ten.
The one thing I don't quite understand at this point in this team, and maybe it's the sample size is too low, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they went 6 for 9 from 3, and for the first half, and for the majority of that game, it seemed like every 3 they took was going to go in, and it's because most of them did. You would think if you're shooting at that high of a rate, you would take maybe double or triple the number of threes. So I know it's not really the style they want to go to, but I mean, you got to think they want to take more than 9 threes a game. I mean, if they took 18 threes and they only made 3 more, like from a basketball perspective, you'd think they would want to take a lot more threes. So that was the one takeaway, and maybe we'll see that number go up. But, you know, that's never really been Brenda Friese's style to just huck up a bunch of threes. So we'll have to see. The question I have for you guys after the first couple of games and after a big game against Duke is, are we going to see anybody else other than these 8 players play more than 5 minutes a game, 10 minutes a game?
I think if Kendall Walker's healthy, she might get some minutes when she comes back. But yeah, I think you probably at this point, if you're playing this limited amount this early, you're not going to change it. So it'll be interesting to watch here down the stretch. And one team that's obviously soaring women's basketball, another team that maybe isn't, is men's soccer, suffering one of the worst losses under Coach Sasha. Tough game, tough way to end the season. Brendan, quickly break down what happened and what we can look forward to here for the Terps.
Not so fast. I will steal one out of Lee Corso's book there. I don't think the season is over because they are going to have a chance to make the NCAA tournament. The bracket will come out next Monday, so we'll see if they end up making the NCAA tournament. But yeah, if you take back the clock exactly a month, on October 11th, Maryland beat Washington 3-2 in Seattle. They controlled their own destiny to the top of the Big Ten. Since that point, they beat George Mason, but that is not a conference game and not really that important to look at. Helps them to get into the NCAA tournament. But since that point, they tied UCLA at home, lost to Michigan on the road, lost to Rutgers on the road, lost to Ohio State at home, and just suffered a loss in the quarterfinals of the Big Ten tournament to UCLA 6-0. 6-0 is a brutal loss, especially a brutal loss when the committee is looking at your overall resume and they look at your schedule and they say, oh, what's the most recent game they played? And it's a loss. And this team was probably one of the top 3 teams in the country a month ago. They probably could have won the NCAA championship. At least they had the pieces and they had the momentum to do it. But there's a reason you don't play the championship in October. There's a reason you play the championship way down the line in November and then into December. That's how the season works. Maryland got hot at the wrong time, and I just do not see them getting hot again. Could they get a slightly good draw to play a worse team, or maybe a team they faced at some point in the NCAA tournament? Sure, but the hopes of winning the NCAA championship with this team are out the window. This team peaked at the second-ranked team in the country, and then like that, immediately 2 weeks, as soon as they got that ranking, they have been awful. They got cursed probably by that ranking, and since that time, they just haven't looked very good. And obviously, some of that has to do with the injury to Leon Kuhl. Sasha doesn't coach against Ohio State. Colin Griffith gets banged up. it's what happens during the course of the season. And I'm sure they wish that the national championship happened a month and a half ago because they probably would have won it. So it's a tough look, and we'll break down what ends up happening when the bracket comes out. But not what I thought we were talking about if you'd asked me just 4 weeks ago.
Definitely, and it's another disappointing loss here for the Terps. Another team suffered another kind of heartbreaking loss, field hockey. Mike, take us through what happened here in the Big Ten tournament, what the Terps can look forward to as they play Duke here in the NCAA.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. So both of their Big Ten tournament games came down to a shootout. They beat Iowa in the quarterfinal in the shootout, but then they lost to Michigan in the semifinals in a shootout. And Coach Missy Mahar said post-game that Maryland couldn't prepare for a shootout against Michigan because the Wolverines had never been in one before. So they had tape on Iowa because they had been in shootouts previously that season, but they had no idea how to approach Michigan's goalkeeper in that semifinal game. And sounds like she kind of credits that towards losing in the shootout when Maryland had been in some previously. But, looking forward to the NCAA tournament. They're heading to UNC. They're actually going to be facing the Duke Blue Devils in that first round. Duke is a number 11 team in the country according to the new updated rankings. Maryland is number 8. So good old-fashioned rivalry between two old ACC rivals, and it should be a good one.
Seems like if they beat Duke, they'll play North Carolina. Brendan, that seems like a really tough matchup.
Yeah, I mean, any team they're going to face because they're not hosting was going to be a tough matchup. We know this team is good enough to go very far in the NCAA tournament. I want to go back to the Big Ten tournament. If you'd showed a Maryland fan the headline, Northwestern loses in Big Ten championship in College Park, Maryland fans would have been super excited. Unfortunately for Maryland, the team that did it was Michigan. Michigan ended up taking over Northwestern and winning the Big Ten tournament. So kudos to them. Northwestern didn't get it done. We thought the matchup was going to be Maryland-Northwestern, as did many field hockey fans. It didn't happen. So Maryland is going to suffer from that. And if they won the Big Ten championship, they probably would be hosting another weekend of games in College Park. But obviously, that didn't happen. Mike, obviously, you covered this team 2 years ago, but I want to ask about the shootout, right? Alyssa Klobosco, one of the best goalkeepers in the country. Why don't they stick with her when it comes down to the shootout? They went with Paige Keft for the shootout against Iowa. Do you know why they decided to make that change?
They did this when I covered them 2 years ago, too. So they had Christina Calandra, who was like their go-to goalkeeper. And then they had Paige Keft, who was like, put her in for a shootout. So my guess, just like they have a specialized shootout goalkeeper, she's better on those one-on-one situations. And they just did not have the tape on Michigan's goalkeeper to know how to attack them in the shootout, and it worked to Michigan's favor.
Wolverines won in the Big Ten tournament. Fortunately, the Terps won't be playing in the Big Ten tournament for volleyball. Brendan, take us through Adam Hughes' team here as they wrap up their season.
Hard to play in something that doesn't exist. A women's volleyball team has turned a bit of a corner, actually. Not something I really suspected. But after not winning a game in over a month, they had that brutal stretch where they barely even won any sets. They won 2 games at home in College Park this past weekend. They beat Michigan State 3-1, and they beat UCLA 3-1. So good to get some momentum back. I think the season now kind of rests, with 6 games remaining. They're 12-13. The season rests on can they get back and, can they finish above 500? They're above 500 for most of the season. And obviously that has to do with out of conference play. But they have Ohio State and Penn State this weekend. Penn State, the 4th-ranked team in the country. That game's at home. Maryland for the past couple of years has taken a ranked opponent kind of to the end, and they won one. They've won a game. They've won a ranked game in a couple of the past seasons. So we'll have to see. But you have to think Maryland wants to get 3 or 4 of the next 6. But I just don't see it happening with the way they played. They get Rutgers, who's the worst team in the conference, so they can carry some of that momentum that they just had in those games this weekend at home. We'll see, but I think the goal at this point in the season has to try to be to finish at or above 500. So we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of weeks, and they finish up their regular season on November 30th.
Talked about all the regular Terp seasons that are playing right now and the current Terp players. Mike, really quick, Marcus Jackson decommitted from Maryland this past week. Quickly break down 30 seconds what this means for the Terps and what we can look maybe next to in the 2025 recruiting class.
Yes, this is very surprising news for Maryland. Jackson committed just over 2 months ago. They're left with only Christian Jeffrey now, a 4-star combo guard from the area. Definitely not a position that Kevin Willard wants to be in right now in November, only having one commitment for the upcoming season. And then again, they've also lost local guys too to Michigan State. They lost both Cam Ward and Jordan Scott, two guys that, especially Jordan Scott with his mom going to Maryland and playing basketball here, that Maryland believed that they could have gotten. So definitely not a position that Kevin Willard wants to be in just less than a year after getting Derek Queen.
Willard said he only plans on bringing around 2 freshmen a year in. Losing, Jackson out of the two is probably the one that you don't want. So that's obviously disappointing for Maryland. It's been a disappointing season for me and Brendan here with the picks. Another tough week. I will start us off though, because Mike, you've started us off too many times. Let's get going here with Texas minus 13.5 against Arkansas. I think the Longhorns roll. Then I'm going to head next to Clemson covering 10 points against Pitt. And finally, I'll finish with the opposite of whatever Mike picks for Colorado. So whatever that line is, give me anti-Buffaloes just to troll Mike.
All right, I'll go next. First pick, Colorado favored by 11 against Utah. The Buffs are only a few wins away now from getting to the college football playoff. They are in the driver's seat now to get into their conference championship. All they got to do is beat BYU, and then they're a lock to get to the college football playoff. Wouldn't that be electric? Coach Prime, Shador, Travis Hunter. Next, Missouri, 12.5-point dogs at South Carolina. That's a line that surprised me. And then last, I'm going to take the Raging Cajuns. I'm going to take Louisiana, favored by 7 points at home against South Alabama.
Yeah, Colorado, they could make the college football playoff. I was saying just a couple weeks ago, I don't think it could happen. BYU looks beatable, and that's all I got to say about Big 12 football, but I'll stick with the Big 10, and I will go with LSU minus 28 against Purdue. Then I will take LSU minus 5 against Florida. That line makes absolutely no sense, which probably means I'm going to be completely wrong. And then I will take UCLA against Washington. UCLA plus 4, and they've actually looked really, really solid in their last 4 games. From picks to Terrific Terp, let's do it. This week's Terrific Terp is Andrew McDonald. His sports impact after his time at Maryland is far greater than his time as an athlete at UMD. However, he still shined on the diamond and the pitch in College Park. To go back to McDonald's impact, we must dial the clocks all the way back to the late 1950s when he arrived on campus in College Park. He played the sports combo that is so common among youth athletes in America, soccer in the fall, and America's classic sport baseball in the spring. At Maryland, he earned all ACC honors in baseball, and in 1957, he did the same thing for soccer. He graduated from Maryland in 1958 with a bachelor's in science, and in his senior season, he served as captain for both the baseball and the soccer teams. His greatest athletic achievement was how he helped the Terps go undefeated in the ACC soccer for 3 straight years and had a 25-5-1 record during his time. After his time at Maryland, he went on to found the athletic department at the Community College of Baltimore County, Essex. From 1962 to 1987, he served as an athletic director and coach. He developed 24 sports there and won 9 NJCAA titles. He was a sports guru, coaching baseball, basketball, golf, and softball during his time. He earned a master's degree from UMD in 1965 and a doctorate education from Southern Mississippi in 1971. The baseball and soccer star turned athletic leader is this week's Terrific Terp.
Shout out Mr. McDonald, our Terrific Terp for this episode. And you can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, X. Anywhere you want to get your content, you can find us. Thank you guys for listening.
Guess what? You've got Under the Shell Podcast. Nobody does it better.